Thank you. What a wonderful gift. And beautiful images in terms of returning to our room and letting the world unfold, which is a marvelous introduction to Max, who returned to his room, banished by his mother, but he returned to his room to let the world unfold, to examine things that he did not understand, to embrace things that he could not comprehend, to deal with emotions and things that were out of control, at least in his experience. Marie Sendak said that, when asked about why I write, reaching kids is really an important part of it, but it's actually secondary. First, always, I have to reach and keep hold of the child in me. And you can see in his books, and especially this one, how he's working out his own childhood, his own sense of disconnection from an emotionally distant mother, an environment that was oppressed by deep and collective grief. And yet there was this wild one. There was this sense of life and exhilaration and playfulness that could not be suppressed. It's a marvelous psychological parable given to us as a gift to explore our own inner world and how it gets expressed or not in a world that is so complicated, so scary, so frightening on so many levels. There are so many scenes in this little story. There's only 10 sentences in this book. But there are so many scenes and images that come to me that I want to address, and I can hardly unpack this story in the little time we have today. So I really do encourage you to see if you can find it either online or in your basements, wherever it might be tucked away, and spend some time with it this week. Max is running around in his wolf suit, absolutely exhilarated with his passion for life, sticking things on the walls and chasing the dog with a fork, when his mother yells at him in Yiddish, a word that really translates, "You are a wild thing." And immediately, he looks up, being a wild thing, as his mother says, in his wolf suit, and says, "I'm going to eat you," which would be a natural response for a wild thing. He actually says that the wild things from this book come from his vision of his relatives that would invade their house, and they were large and ugly in his mind, and they'd always lean over, and one of them in particular, an aunt, would always lean over and take his cheek and squeeze it and say, "Oh, you're so cute, I could eat you." And that was his image of the wild things, where they came from. So when he said that, of course, his mother banished him to the room without supper. Now, she could have embraced him and said, "Oh, yes, you are my wild thing, and I love you dearly." But because of her own story, because of surely the things that were going on in her world, she didn't have that space, that capacity to embrace the wild thing in Max. So he's in his room, and he stews, and he reflects, and he wonders. And he enters into this space where he becomes, in a fantasy world, a different person, or a fuller person, an extension of who he is. And a private boat. I thought I had the picture up here, but I don't. No. But the second picture in the book is of him traveling in this little sailboat, and he's got this beautiful smile on his face. It's just this lovely sense of contentment that he's gone from this difficult encounter with his mother to being banished to his room, but his imagination and his fantasy world has taken him to a different place. And he's sailing on this ocean, which you'd think for a 7, 8-year-old would be a little scary. But you can see the waves are just enough to take the boat along. And you can see a one lonely tree leaning into the ocean as if he's close enough to the land to be able to trust where he is and where he's going. The ocean has this deepening shade of blue and these little white caps suggesting this ideal or idyllic world, an exhilarating amount of wind. And he is on his journey. He's on his journey of exploration. The writer Francis Spofford has suggested that this book is one of the very few picture books to make an entirely deliberate and beautiful use of the psychological story of anger. A fascinating study of intense emotions, disappointment, fury, even rage, and their transformation through creative activity, imagination, and fantasy. And it is. It's an empowering, psychologically astute parable about a child learning that his anger, while sometimes overwhelming and scary, can be safely expressed and even managed. So, Max comes to the place of the wild things. I encountered many interviews when I was preparing for today with Sendik, and one of the best ones was Bill Moyers from PBS, his interview show. He interviewed him once. And Moyers was telling Sendak of Joseph Campbell, who, of course, Moyers did a lot of work with. Joseph Campbell, who studied mythologies around the world and really was the go-to person around mythology. And he said that Campbell regarded the scene where Max comes face to face with the wild things, and they roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth, as one of the greatest moments in literature. He said it was so because it's only when a person is able to tame their own demons that they become rulers of themselves, if not the world. In many ways, Max models a path of mindfulness in this little story, a psychologically and spiritually healthy way to encounter our anger and all the other emotions, the wild things within us and around us. The moment when he greets the wild things, let's see if I have it here. Come on. Bo, could you just turn the next slide? Thank you. The moment when he encounters them, the book says he does a trick where he looks into their eyes and says, "Be still." What a marvelous phrase. Do you remember Jesus using the same phrase for us? When all the disciples are going to bail out of the boat because of the storm, and Jesus simply says, "Be still." Not first to the people, to the storm itself. "Be still, my anger. Be still, all my raging emotions. Let me befriend you." He looks right in each of their eyes, into the yellow of the eyes, the story says. The story says it's a trick, but maybe it's a practice we are invited into, to embrace the wild things within us. Be still, as if he is courageous enough to befriend what's within. Even the romp that he invites him into next, where they go wild and dancing and playfulness, it really feels like he's completely mindful of these things need to dance. These things in me need to be exposed, need to be explored, need to be honored. And so they play, they romp. And there's an expression of his own wildness, of our animal nature, of our imagination that is so important on the healing. As adults, what do we do with our rage, our anger? So many of us have been taught to suppress, to push away, to ignore, to be in denial. And so often when that happens, our anger gets projected onto those around us. And in the process, we make them other. We separate and we label and we divide and we define. There are so many recent examples of this in our world. It's painful to hear the stories day after day. This shadow, both individual and collective, seems to be escalated as we reel from one violent outburst after another. I read a story about, the interview of the shooter in El Paso, who acknowledged that he was there to intentionally shoot Mexicans because in his warped and confused place, he thought that would make America great again. His anger and his oppressed sense of who he was so palpable that he felt that was his only way of going to the place of the wild things. It's such a greater tragedy than one town or one incident. The tragedy of not being fully human, not being invited in, or as our prayer this morning said, to be gathered into the one fabric of what it means to be human and part of humanity. When we are overcome with rage, we say things like, "I was not myself," or "I really didn't know what came over me." Well, Carl Jung would call it the shadow came over us. If you feel this sense of overwhelming emotion or rage coming up in you when a friend might give you some feedback or point out some fault, or someone we love is critical of us or hurts us in some way, then we are discovering a part of our shadow, our unconscious. To become conscious of it involves the recognition that the darker aspects of our personality are present and are real in us. And they are not things to be banished. They are things to explore, to travel to look into the eye of. I'm going to share a story from my own life. I never imagined I would share this story in a public space. Part of it I share because Hillhurst seems to draw out vulnerability in people, and I think that's a gift of this community. But part of it is this story just kept coming to me as I was reflecting on where the wild things are. And it's a simple enough story. When I was 13, just started grade 9 in high school, trying to bond with my new friends and be part of the action, I was invited to a party, and for whatever reason, my mother banished me from this party. She wouldn't give me a ride, and she said no. I think she didn't know my new friends and suspected something. Well, that wasn't good enough for me, of course, being banished without supper. I was going to the party anyways, and so another friend of mine, across as a neighbor, decided to go with me, and the buses weren't running. We had no way to get there, so we hitchhiked, which was the thing to do back in 1969, I hate to admit. So we were picked up really quickly by a big blue car, and a middle-aged guy got out, and he said, "Come on in, but my back doors don't work, so you have to get in the front seat with me." Of course, later I realized that was the first warning. So we sat in, my friend sat in the middle, I sat on the outside, and we're driving along almost to the road where we need to turn right to get to our destination. So we said, "You could drop us off here." When he went through the light, turned left, and went at a high speed up this road out of town, and just kept driving into the dark. And after about 5 minutes, he told my friend to take his pants down, and he molested him. It's a moment when life kind of freezes. And it wasn't that I even panicked necessarily. I just knew there was stuff in me and stuff in that car that I had no imagination for about how to respond to. After a few minutes, the driver turned the car light on, the interior light on, and looked straight at me. And all I could do was look him in the eyes. And what I remember, what occurred to me was, even though he was big and middle-aged and a powerful man, he actually seemed to have more fear than I did. He turned the light off and told me to do the same as my friend. And I said, "No. Stop the car and let us out." And there was silence, and I said again louder, "Stop the car and let us out." And he finally did, and we got out, and he drove off. And we walked along the road. By this time, it was getting quite late, and we realized we were 4 miles out of town, and we kept walking, and then he came back. And so we hid in the bushes, and he drove slowly, looking for us, obviously, came back looking for us, and we kept hiding back and forth. Finally, we made it all the way back to the edge of town. We phoned our parents, made up a really lame excuse. I can't even remember what it was now. I got home, and your father sat me down in the living room, and he's a lawyer. Took him about 30 seconds to unpack my story, and got the truth out. Brought the neighbors over with the son and told basically what had happened. And I remember the outburst of my friend's father, who simply said, "Oh my God, I can't believe it. My own son's been molested by a homo." As if he had no comprehension about what his son had gone through. But that's when we get so caught up in our own stuff that we have no idea how to manage. Anyway, we went through the whole process of police and looking at mugshots, doing the whole thing. And it was an ugly experience. The thing is that nobody had the capacity to talk to me about it. My parents certainly didn't have the tools or abilities. But I was at school about a week later. And I was in grade 9, I was doing theater arts, and I loved theater arts. I loved being part of the drama, and we were preparing for a one-act play festival, and I was really into it. And after about a long rehearsal, my theater arts teacher asked me to stay behind. And he said to me, "What's going on with you?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, what's happening with you? You seem not to be yourself. You seem angry. You seem to be ridiculing your colleagues and using your humor, which is usually delightful, in terrible ways. What's going on with you?" I had no choice. I was defenseless. I just told him the story. And he listened, and he said 2 things. One is, you probably need to see the guidance counselor and spend some time with them. But 2, maybe it's possible for you to take that anger you feel, which I understand, and put it into the play, not on us. Put it into your character. Let the play help you. Express it, because your character is kind of angry too. And that invitation, both that honored what I was experiencing, but helping me to become conscious of what I was very unconscious of, was a gift that to this day I remember and respect. And I don't think I ever truly understood what it meant to project stuff from inside of me, how that could even happen, onto those I love and like and work with. But it's a power. And that person had the gift of insight and awareness to invite me in to greet the wild things, to look the wild things in the eye, to embrace them, to acknowledge them, to befriend them, and then to say, like Max, "I've had enough. I don't need you anymore. Go to bed without your supper." Right? Because he was done feeding the wild things that had brought him all kinds of things, but he was done feeding them. And what does the story say? Well, I don't think I can do it better than Maurice, so let me read. "Now stop," Max said, and sent the wild things off to bed without their supper. And Max, the king of all wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. And then all around, from far away across the world, he smelled good things to eat. So he gave up being king of where the wild things are, and sailed back over a year, in and out of weeks and through a day, and into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him. And it was still hot. Hey, we all have stuff We all have all these wild things within us, and they're gifts. There's gold in those wild things. I invite you to be gentle, to embrace them, to trust your own story and lived experience enough to befriend these things in your life, but not to use them as a hammer in the world. Befriend them and send them to bed. And come home. Come back to your room where the grand meal of grace and love is waiting. Hot, nourishing, a gift. May this be the meal that gathers you and I in. Indeed, may this be the world that gathers all